In late 1962 and early 1963, desegregation was a major issue throughout the American South. Keep in mind that the United States Supreme Court had ruled that segregation of public schools was illegal in May of 1954. Yet, more than 7 years later, there were still many who argued that that ruling wasn't real. In January of 1963, a group of 8 religious leaders from Alabama issued a statement. It was called An Appeal for Law and Order and Common Sense. They wrote about those who opposed desegregation, saying, "Many sincere people oppose this change and are deeply troubled by it. As Southerners, we understand this." They affirmed and commended 7 statements to their people. And one of those should sound very familiar to many modern Episcopalians. Every human being, quote, "Every human being is created in the image of God and is entitled to respect as a fellow human being with all the basic rights and privileges and responsibilities which belong to humanity." However, this wasn't the final word from these clergymen. There would go on to be many peaceful protests in Birmingham, Alabama, urging desegregation, urging compliance with the Supreme Court and the Constitution. This upset many in the white establishment. And so, on April 12th, 1963, which was also Good Friday, those same 8 clergymen issued another statement. They said again that they wanted honest convictions in racial matters handled in the courts, not in the streets. They decried public demonstrations by, quote, "some of our Negro citizens directed and led in part by outsiders." They said these protests were untimely and unwise. They called on, quote, "our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations." Now, that same day, Good Friday, a 34-year-old pastor from Atlanta, who had also served a church in Montgomery, Alabama, was arrested for peacefully protesting. And while in jail, that pastor was handed a copy of the clergyman's statement, which was entitled "A Call for Unity." And that pastor responded with something you're almost certainly aware of. What became known as the letter from the Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King, Jr. Those 8 clergymen were telling their local black population, who were not allowed to actually be part of their congregations, to quiet down. They were saying, just be patient. Wait for justice to be given to them. They were saying, don't rock the boat. To stay in their place. It's worth pointing out that 2 of those 8 clergymen were in fact Episcopal bishops. This was wrong, obviously. They were on the wrong side of history and of the gospel. This might all seem like ancient history and irrelevant to today. But it also echoes with today's gospel passage. And I felt important to draw that connection and to remember who Jesus was and is. Our reading today continues with Mark, with Jesus and the disciples continuing on their journey toward Jerusalem, toward Palm Sunday. And they are on the outskirts of the major trading city of Jericho. A blind beggar, Bartimaeus, heard that Jesus was passing through. He called out to Jesus, calling him the Son of David, and asked for mercy. Those in the crowd near Bartimaeus tried to silence him, but he persisted. Jesus stopped and asked for Bartimaeus to come forward. Bartimaeus cast off his cloak and came to Jesus. Jesus asked him what he wanted. Bartimaeus asked to be able to see once again. Jesus told him that his faith had made him well. And Bartimaeus could immediately see and then followed Jesus. Bartimaeus was bold. He had suffered as an extreme outsider. He was blind. He was a beggar, and he was the son of one that was seen as unclean. He knew that his situation needed to change. And so he pleaded with God's Son for mercy. But Bartimaeus was also being rebellious. He called Jesus the Son of David. And that meant that he was acknowledging that Jesus was of the line of David, and therefore should be king, just as David had been. But Jesus should be their ruler, not Rome or some Roman puppet. That is sedition. And that's why people in the crowd tried to silence Bartimaeus. He was publicly acknowledging Jesus' place as Jewish royalty. He was acknowledging Jesus not simply as the Son of David, but also as the Son of God. And that scared the people around him. They didn't want Jesus to challenge the status quo. They didn't want Jesus rocking the boat. They didn't want Jesus to change anything. Those who sought to silence Bartimaeus were just like those 8 clergymen who tried to silence Black Alabamans and Martin Luther King. And in both cases, thankfully, the silencers failed. Bartimaeus was bold. He longed to be restored to the community. When he learned that Jesus was passing by, Bartimaeus cast off his cloak. And that cloak had effectively been his home as he sat along that roadside. And when he cast it off, he was leaving behind all of his worldly possessions and presenting himself naked before God and God's Son. Bartimaeus did this out of faith. Faith that Jesus would recognize his humanity and his dignity. Faith that Jesus would make him whole. Bartimaeus took risks for his faith. He was willing to risk everything to be in the presence of Jesus. It's important to notice Jesus' words and actions here. He called on Bartimaeus to come forward. And then he asked what Bartimaeus wanted. Now, Jesus, of course, already knew what Bartimaeus wanted because, well, he's Jesus. And yet, Jesus asked him. He didn't make assumptions. Instead, Jesus recognized Bartimaeus' free will and autonomy. This reminds us all that recognizing the dignity of every human being means don't make assumptions. Bartimaeus is a role model for us all. We are to follow his example and take risks for our faith. We must be willing to speak out against intolerable situations. We must be willing to leave what we know for the unknown. We must be willing to upset the status quo when in pursuit of a just cause. But those 8 Alabama clergymen are also role models for us. We must not hold on to our power and the status quo at the expense of others. We must not try to silence others who earnestly advocate for others. Instead, we must live into the words of those clergymen in their first statement. Every human being is created in the image of God and is entitled to respect as a fellow human being with all basic rights, privileges, and responsibilities which belong to humanity. And so, as this tumultuous election season hopefully draws to a close, let us remember that our role as followers of Christ is to seek to grow in faith, hope, and charity, while boldly continuing to see Christ in all people and love all as we love ourselves. Amen.